Morning, everybody. This day is about karma. Karma means action, and action, of course, in the context of your life. But more than just your life, it's also in the context of your world. We may think we know what the world is, but in fact there are different views of what that might be. In Buddhism, there are certainly more than one view. And it's difficult to fit karma into a Buddhist context without giving the worldview that's appropriate or appropriate to that particular tradition. So what I want to do first of all is to give some idea of the worldview in our particular tradition and use that as the setting to talk about karma. The absolutely essential theme, one I think would be right to say in all forms of Buddhism, is the centrality of awareness. And sometimes also, particularly Trungpa Rinpoche's approach, the idea of openness, more than an idea, more than something that you put into place when you meditate and relate to the world, to be as open as you can in every situation in which you find yourself. Awareness and spaciousness go together. You might say they're like two different sides of the same coin. There's a single thing. The awareness, one may think one knows what awareness is because one would say, well, I've got awareness, sort of. I think I'm aware of things. Admittedly, sometimes I'm not. But generally speaking, I feel I've got some understanding perhaps of what awareness might be. However, the awareness most people think of when they say awareness or consciousness or whatever is something that tends to go up and down. So sometimes the awareness seems to be greater than at others. But the basic idea in Buddhism is that there is what you might call a continuity of awareness. Awareness is a constant. It's always with us. Whether subjectively its intensity seems to vary. We feel duller perhaps at some times and more bright at others. It's not really relevant that. There's a basic ground, you might say, of awareness which is common, no matter what the seeming ups and downs of the intensity might be. The awareness is very special in a way that perhaps it's not really noticed by people that much. And that is that it's a thing that everybody has, of course, but everything is interpreted and expressed in terms of it. If I think about the world, if I think about the vast outer world, thinking of galaxies and suns and so forth, and notions of the very small might be like atoms, and faraway places which I've never encountered. All these things are expressed as sometimes as direct sense perceptions. I can see the stars. You see material things, you can't see the atoms. The notions of galaxies, though one might be able to see them through telescopes as spots of light, the more elaborated ideas of what they might be, the ideas of the structures of stars, notions of atoms and so on, are not directly accessible to perception, but certainly we have ideas about them. And in Buddhism, we don't just say there are 5 senses, we say there are 6 senses. Nothing sort of magical about the 6th sense particularly, But just sixth sense means mind, in the sense that what arises as experience of the mind might be internal perceptions of memories of things you have heard or smelt or touched or whatever, thoughts that come into your mind. All those kinds of things would be considered to be perceptions of mind. So there, in that sense, there are six consciousnesses. Maybe you can say, as it's been said, sometimes there's suggestions that human beings have other senses. Of course, just as animals have sometimes quite extensions of senses in which ways that we don't have. But in some sense, still, you could say that they were connected to the six senses altogether. If you had some way of, say, you could see in some other part of the spectrum, you'd still say perhaps that was connected with the eye in some way. So there is certainly the sense in which we perceive the world through our senses, through mind. And that's actually all we have as far as our perceptual experience goes. People say, well, what about the external world that seems to be separate from all of that, in the sense that it's there and I perceive it, but obviously it's still there when I'm not perceiving it. What status does that have? Well, the fact that you can all, for example, agree to come to this particular meeting means there's a certain, what you might call, consensus reality with the experience. You can agree to come here because it seems that sense expression, sense experience of the world and so on, relate together in certain patterns which seem to be repeatable, which seem to form logical patterns of everyday sense of causality anyway. And in that sense, they seem to be something that we can rely on. But although we're relying on that, our assumption that there is a physical universe there that we are perceiving seems, when you think about it, possibly the wrong way round. What you know is what you perceive and the consensus of your experience, and you're working with others. So the truth of the matter really is that it is what you do with others, how you work with others, that produces this consensus of experience that gives us the idea that there is an externally existing world. So the externally existing world is derived from the consensus. It's not the other way round. But it's like somehow we feel that perhaps in our search and wish for something reliable, external to ourselves, to give us some kind of backdrop, we feel that we need such a thing as that. But from our perspective, we extend the idea of mind to mean not just what I experience through the senses and not what just I experience through memories, thoughts and so on, but the underlying sense that there is something that binds all these together, and this is still connected with awareness, with some quality of awakenedness. The great 14th century Nyingma teacher, Longchen Rabjam, said that the mind, in its true sense, could be seen as like a mirror. The power of the mirror, or the power of the mind, is that things appear in it. it isn't that things are reflected in this mirror of the mind from some external place or some other reality. It is just that they appear. It's more like the idea of the old magicians who thought in terms of a divining mirror or divining speculum, that you looked in a mirror made of polished metal, maybe, and as you looked in what you might call a meditative frame of mind, I suppose, various things appeared, various objects appeared that looked like things seen, heard, smelt, tasted, sometimes familiar, sometimes not familiar. But they didn't come from anywhere. So the things that appear in this mirror of mind don't really come from anywhere either. Longchen Rabjam made a very interesting remark. He sometimes got quite irritated by the fact of what he thought was people's obtuseness about things. And one of the things he said is that the mind that consists of flickering thoughts, experiences and memories that come and go, that none of these things are truly mind. These are reflections in the mirror of mind, so they're not really mind at all. And similarly with the colourfulness of sense perceptions and sensory experience. And within this same mirror of mind, many things could appear, to do not just with one person, but perhaps with many. So the colourfulness of the mirror of mind is the colourfulness, you might say, of all our lives and all our experience, as well as all our thought processes. He said this mirror, if I wanted to give you or show you the mirror of the mind, it wouldn't be much good me holding it up a mirror. It has to be a bit bigger than that. The mirror of the mind has no limit. It is what they sometimes call the great expanse. Sometimes the great void, it's described as, beyond all the complications of existence. It's endless, vast, limitless. It's more than a mirror. A mirror is a plane surface, generally speaking. That's how we think of it. Maybe curved a little bit in some instances, but basically we think of it as a plane surface. In this case, the mirror is much more than that. It's, you might say, a multidimensional mirror, I suppose. Everything that you could imagine is reflected in this mirror. When we talk about openness and spaciousness, it's very easy to think we're talking about the world of space that we know and the things in it. But it could be much more than that. It could be the space of emotions, the space of feelings. They have a kind of spaciousness of their own. And for example, one could talk about distance as regards feelings of closeness, maybe. In that case, for example, somebody I have no connection or affinity to might be sitting next to me. That case, he would say, well, they're very near you. But actually, in the space of relationships and affinity, they might be very far away. Similarly, I may have somebody I loved who lives in Australia, very long distance away in ordinary spatial terms, but very close to me on the spectrum, one might say, of relationships and of feeling. So that connection, that way of thinking about feelings and emotions and connections is just as much a space as the space that we're familiar with as regards distance. And other examples can be produced. There are many, many kinds of space, in fact. And this mirror of the mind encompasses them all. Sometimes the mirror is called the great purity. And the great purity is the idea of not being affected or contaminated by something. It isn't the idea of pure, I should make it plain here, perhaps, that the idea of purity here isn't connected with sexuality or anything like that one might suppose in the West. But it's more the idea of, as somebody described it once, as like chemical purity, meaning it doesn't have an associated taint or contaminant. And what it means in this case, when it is said that the mirror of the mind is great purity, it simply means that it is not contaminated by anything that happens in the mirror. Because in the mirror, one sees all the heartaches and joys of existence. One sees there sometimes ideas of purity and impurity in every sense of the word. One might see there ugliness in all the meanings that ugliness might have. One might see beauty. One might see many things in the mirror. And sometimes it seems like it's coming together into just one thing. In the mirror, one might see causes. Just like, for example, to change the metaphor a little bit, if you were to see a film, for example, and you see someone in the film shooting somebody, and you see their body drop down, and they're lying dead. Actually, of course, nothing's happened, because it's all just coloured projections of light on a screen. Nothing's actually happened. Nobody's dead. Nobody got shot. All the apparent causality in there is just fictitious. So the same thing could be said of the mirror, that you may get patterning, you might get apparent logic in the patterns in the mirror, which might seem like the world about us. But actually, that also is fictitious in the same way. The basic mirror itself is unaffected by the things that are reflected in the mirror and that seem to appear in the mirror. And that's the great purity. The mirror of mind, the mirror of awareness, is not affected by any of the reflections perceived within it. And you must remember the reflections perceived in it are our world and what we perceive and what we think, and everything that constitutes what we think of as existence. So great purity is the mirror of the mind, not touched or contaminated by any such things as that. Sometimes it's described as the great sameness, to mean that we may want to make great distinctions about the things that happen in the mirror, the things that happen to us, the things that happen in the world. We want to say this person is different from that person. This person is a bad person who's behaved badly to many people. This other person is good, behaves well, and so forth. One may make big distinctions between somebody who lives in a palace and somebody who lives in a hovel. And yet all these things are appearances in the mirror. In the great sameness, because there is just the mirror, there is no distinctions between these things. They're all equal. The hovel is the same as the palace. In essence, the good person, you might say, is the same as the bad. And similarly, wherever you look, where there seem to be many distinctions continually being made, in the great sameness of the mirror of the mind itself, these are not to be found. And then finally, in connection with the thing which is dear to all Buddhist hearts anyway, the idea of the possibility of liberation, that is that through the development of insight and understanding, one might become free from the sufferings and problems of the world, not only for oneself, but for others, of course. How's that to be done? It said here that this can never happen within the context of the reflections of the mirror. There is no enlightenment in the mirror, in the reflections of the mirror. Enlightenment, or what is called in this context the great liberation, occurs by recognizing the nature of this great mirror of the mind. Because in that, great liberation occurs by simply recognizing reflections are just reflections. They do not stain or contaminate the mirror. They seem to be different in themselves, but fundamentally their nature is all equal. There is just the great liberation of mind, which is the mirror itself. So if you might say, what is the job of Buddhists, as it were, from this particular point of view? And it is to realize this mirror-like nature of the mind. The interesting thing is that that can't be done in a direct way, and it can't really be done through meditation. So you might say the process of meditation is itself still an operation that takes place within the reflections of the mirror. By meditating, one might be able to change and alter the pattern of the reflections in the mirror, but you would not, as it were, be able to see outside the mirror. It's not like the reflections could turn round and somehow look and see that they were appearing in this mirror. Wouldn't be possible to do that. The fact is that the appearances that come from mind are like you might say, the radiation or the light that comes from the nature of the mind itself. In other words, when one talks about the things that appear in the mirror, there's a certain way in which they spontaneously appear because the mirror is what it is. And if you were to ask yourself, well, what am I? Am I just a reflection in the mirror? Well, it doesn't seem very likely that you would be just that. Certain aspects of what one calls oneself are to do with the reflections in the mirror. But the basic nature of what I am, the basic nature of what you are, your true mind, is the mirror itself. So it is possible for you at some point to rest in that true nature of mind, which is the mind's mirror. The interesting thing that makes it difficult to discern, difficult to work with, is that it never becomes an object of thought. Because if it did, somehow you'd be talking about something that was in the mirror again. It's as though you have to learn to relax, rest, and just be. I won't say be yourself, because one of the things that one understands by practicing is that one's sense of self is ego-oriented, ego-structured, and fundamentally has some kind of falseness about it. In fact, it collapses under the power of insight. The insight, of course, really comes from the true mind that we're speaking of here. All the things that are mysterious, pass beyond concepts and knowledge, have their origin in this mirror-like mind itself. But they aren't reflections in the mirror. The question is, of course, how you would learn to meditate, learn to rest. You ought to say resting ought to be easy. But of course, learning to rest is difficult even in the best of times and even in ordinary circumstances. So it's very difficult to know what resting means in this particular context. Also, it's very difficult for people to feel convinced about the truth of this truly bright and clear mind's nature. Sometimes said the reasons against it are it is too close. It is closer than your heart. It's closer than the very essence of what you are, almost. Because it is you, in a very profound sense, away from the confused notions of your understanding of what you might seem to be. So it's completely free from your ordinary notions of egocentricity. Completely free from those. That mirror-like nature of the mind is you. It is ultimately close. And there's a sense in which people almost don't want to believe that. It combines with the other problem that people have with it. It's all too easy. Because if that's all there is, and it's all ultimately close, you don't have to do anything. Where would you go? There's a nice Indian doha, which is like a kind of the original koans, I think, were the Indian dohas really. They're little sayings that point to something. And this says, there is a woman searching for her husband. And she meets a wise man, and he said, "Woman, what are you searching for?" She said, "I've lost my husband. I'm looking for him." He said, "Go home. He's waiting at home." So you look externally for something, and there's something exciting about that because there's a search. Gives you an occupation. If you have that as your concern, that you need an occupation. But actually you could just return home and rest and relax. Because that's where your nature actually is. So it is problematic for people because it is too close. It is problematic because it is too easy. And finally, it is said that it is problematic because it is too good. It's the source, the mirror is the source of all truly good things. Not the things that flitter and flutter and sometimes seem pure and sometimes impure, sometimes seem this and sometimes they seem that in the mirror. But the true goodness, let us say the primordial nature of love and compassion beyond thought, that cannot be discriminated as being this or that. All these things, the boundless states as they're called, originate from this primordial, beginningless nature of mind. It's beginningless because it has no origin. Sometimes it is described as spontaneously existent, meaning its existence, the existence of this mind does not depend on causes, but it exists in itself, by itself. In some sense, you might say through its own nature it exists. If you wanted to search for ultimate origins, you would go on forever. Because you would always say, well, maybe this causes that, maybe that's caused by that, etc., etc. And you would go on forever. But that doesn't happen with this mind, with this true nature of mind. It stops in itself. What you can do, although you can't really see its nature, what you can experience is what you might call its absence, realizing the non-presence of it everywhere. And that produces a sense of spaciousness, ungraspability. But still, that in itself is not enough. You need that. And part of formless meditation, which I think you've done some today, that has two aspects to it. One aspect is learning not to grasp and to realize the endless spaciousness of the awareness that you practice when you expand outwards into space, that is associated with the quality of almost nothingness, the very lack of all the things that we think of that make up existence. And there needs to be something further. There needs to be some kind of inspiration. An inspiration that connects you to the primordial nature of mind, not in a conceptual way, but in a way that is beyond understanding and beyond thought. And it's that you learn eventually to rest in. If you still say to me, how do you rest in it? I suppose the end I have to say, I have no idea. It's like saying, in a way, well, how do you become enlightened? How do you become awakened? Well, you can practice to make everything the mind grasps at collapse. You can do that. You can be inspired to realize it's possible to rest. But then, at some point, you have to do it. And at this point, in order to understand that, I think I have to bring in another thing that is quite problematic in the West nowadays. Very understandably so, but nevertheless, it's indispensable, really. And that is, if you want to be introduced to this nature of mind, this true mind, somebody has to introduce you. It's like being introduced to somebody who's very punctilious. You can't actually approach them and say, stick out your hand and say, I'm Bill Smith or Joe Bloggs or Jane Brown or whatever. It's like they would immediately turn their back on you somehow. That wouldn't, because you haven't been properly introduced. It's a bit old-fashioned, I agree, but still happens sometimes, some places. To be introduced to the nature of mind means you have to have an intermediary, as it were, somebody who does it for you, somebody who can introduce you to that nature. And that person is the person we call the guru. We like to think, I know, in the West that somehow you can do it all yourself. But you can't. Because what you do has... it's like an artist who's always intent upon making sure their name will be on their picture. They always paint their name on, no matter how small it might be. It's like all the actions that you do have your name on them. Written very small, maybe. The cleverer you are, the better you are at non-grasping, as it were, the smaller the letters will be. But they'll still be there. because you can't get rid of the grasping mind yourself, because there is grasping involved in trying to do that. So it's absolutely essential that you have somebody to do this introduction. We think it's a rather dangerous thing to have a teacher like that, perhaps. A teacher on whom one is reliant in a very profound way, because they think, well, we think we might be taken advantage of in some sense. Is that possible? Well, yeah, it is possible, of course. And there are examples of that kind of thing happening, though whether the people who took advantage were really gurus in the true sense of the word is, to say the least, a moot point. But certainly you do need somebody to do it. Whether one likes it or not, there doesn't seem to be any way around that. The introduction is made sometimes by what is called a pointing out instruction. Somebody points the nature of mind out to you, and since they do it, there isn't the sense that it comes from you. That's a very important idea. It may seem quite, well, there seems very little in that. You say, well, you know, somebody just showed it to me. What's the difference between me finding it out myself? Well, it's actually quite a big difference. If there's some egocentricity left, it is always strong. I said the egocentricity might be very weak, but actually egocentricity is always the same. It's only the apparent effects, its apparent radiation that might seem to be weak. The actual core of it is always the same. It's always the, if you like, the single centrality of ego. It's always there. It's always complete. The only way that you cannot have that in any insight you have is having that handed to you by somebody else. It's not like, interestingly enough, very much seems to happen. There are stories of some of the Dzogchen masters who taught their pupils in a very simple, direct way. So there's a story of one who was asked by his teacher, well, you know, have you realized the nature of mind? And he said, no, I'm afraid I haven't. He said, oh, it's really quite simple. He said, come and lie down by my side, look up at the stars. He said, you see the stars, you see the sky? He said, yes. You hear the dogs barking in the monastery down there? He said, yeah. He said, well, that's it. And his mind opened, and he realized through that. And as people have said, sometimes Tibetans have said, well, it's very strange, isn't it? Because he hasn't really said anything, you know. He just talked about ordinary sense perceptions, you know. Do you hear the dogs barking? Do you see the stars or whatever? Well, so what? But it's enough. And the question is why it's enough. The pupil is ready, as it were, and the teacher is able to do it, is there, and not much is needed. You can't say what the kinds of words will be. Sometimes the words don't make any sense. I remember my teacher once saying, not to me, but to someone else, she said, oh, I've got all these problems about this and that and the other, sort of quite ordinary problems. He said, you're riding a horse that has no back. And she was totally astonished by this. But again, it's doesn't mean anything directly. It means even less than saying, listen to the dogs barking. Dog's wonderful. Horse with no back? I don't think so. Yet it seemed to have meaning to her and to affect her life considerably. So having a guru in this sense is very important. Having a guru who can give you the introduction, essential. When you are given the instruction, you make the leap, as it were, from appearing to be in the mirror to be able to perceive or experience the mirror itself. It's like the projections of the mind, that you always look away from the mind, you always look into the projections in the mirror. They're the things we see all the time. We're affected by that, and when we believe they're the reality, and we believe it tremendously strongly. And so much so that certain things we think, well, they must really be there. It can't be an illusion. For example, there's the meditations on what are called the 3 times, past, present, and future. If I look at the past, the past is very real and solid to me. And if I tried to say to you, well, it's possible the past doesn't exist, and nor does the present, and nor does the future, it sounds mad to say that, because they seem very solid, familiar territory. But of course one can approach it so that one begins to see the nature of the 3 times, past, present, and future, and one can begin to see that crumble. If I ask myself about things I experienced in the past, they're thoughts. When I think of my past, when I think of things that happened, obviously I'm thinking about my past. But when does that happen? You know, it happens now. Nobody ever thought anything in the past. So how can you? You can only think now. You can't think in the past. You may have the conception that you thought in the past, but that's a present thought again. So whenever you think about your thoughts of the past, they're always in the present. And if you ask yourself how you know something is past, or present, or future for that matter, it has a flavour about it that makes it past, or makes it present, or makes it future. Certain thoughts have the flavour of pastness about them. But that flavour of pastness is happening now. It doesn't happen in the past. So within the present, you have a conviction about the reality of the past. But that conviction of the reality of the past is in the present. So when you think about that, there's something a bit strange about that. But when you look to the future, you can't find any future because it hasn't arrived yet. When you look to the future, you don't find anything. When you look into the past, you only find the present. When you look in the future, if you've got a concept about it, that concept happens now, so that's in the present as well. So everything just becomes present. But trouble is, if everything is present, it hasn't got any context of past and future, which we think are essential. So as the past and the future begin to collapse, you might say, inwards towards the present itself begins to collapse. So you end up suddenly having the experience that you've no idea what past, present, and future are. And that's quite a shock. And then you've seen something about the nature of past, present, and future, which is a given appearance in the mirror itself. It doesn't exist. It's not that the past, present, and future exist externally to it any more than place does. Place are also simply an appearance of reflected images in the mirror, nothing more than that. So there is no past, present, or future that you can pin down, and there is no place that you can pin down. Because if I say, this place where you are now is Oxford Town Hall or whatever, how do you know that? You know that through the experience that you have of the place around you, the objects, the Victorian tiling or what it might be outside in the corridors, very much a sense of this kind of building. So you've got a concept and a structure associated with it, and an idea of Oxford itself and it being in Oxford. But in fact, all that you really have are thoughts and ideas and sense perceptions. What you should be asking is not where you are now, but where the sense perceptions and sensory experience and thoughts are. And if you ask where they are, they're certainly not in Oxford. Because after all, Oxford is a construction from them. So how can they be in the thing out of which the place itself is constructed? And if you start looking and perceiving in this way, the idea of place begins to collapse as well. So the nature of things in the mirror are not as solid as they seem. It may be something of the true nature of place beyond thought, the true nature of time beyond thought exists in the mind itself. But it certainly doesn't exist in the projections we make of past, present and future and ordinary places and things. When we talk about karma, which means action, as I said, this is something that appears in the mirror of the mind. Sometimes this mirror of the mind is called the mirror of karma, the mirror in which one can see the things that arise and pass away, things that appear due to actions, volitions, as though the whole of one's history could be perceived in this mirror, and the future as well, for that matter. The mirror of mind, or the mirror of karma, is like something that reflects back to us. So if we think of ourselves in some sense as being the mind, the reflections, is true, are appearing in there. But one of the conceptions that we have is that we are separate from the mirror, we are looking at it, we perceive things in it, and things are reflected back to us. The actions that I do appear, as it were, in the mirror, and the energy of that comes back to me, and the appearances that are part of the karma appear to me. As examples, if I have a mind that is very hating and aggressive, I perform actions that are like that. My speech is like that. My mind is like that. Maybe not universally, it's something that comes and goes, of course. We take an extreme case. Maybe a person is very aggressive, but everybody has some aggression. That aggressiveness, a little bit like a fire that is reflected back to us. something that might seem rather burning somehow. And it could take on various forms. Could be that it seems when I am got a very negative attitude to things, then my whole environment seems to be like that. And seems to be like that because I'm like that. But it's also thought that there is a mysteriousness to karma, in the sense that it is not just my mind that perceives that heat or energy of hatred back to me, but that the objects in the environment are actually created in such a way as to be things that are associated or have some connection with my own hatred. That there are things, as it were, in the world that I find annoying or irritating just because they're there. It's not my attitude particularly, but there are actually things in the world that seem to almost have been created for the purpose of annoying me. It does have a certain mental aspect to it, I'm sure. But it seems like from the Buddhist conception of karma, there's something more to it than that. There's a kind of genuineness of negativity in the environment itself. So the power of the mirror of karma comes back to me as something, what you might call a mental bias, and some actual object, some natural objectification in the world that corresponds to my hatred. You may wonder why that happens, because it sounds quite a kind of magical view of the world somehow. And the reason for that is the fact that the world, in this view of the mirror and the contents of the mirror, does not actually exist as a material object as such. The world, as we see it, is a creation of the minds of beings. As I talked about the consensus reality. What you see around you is created by the beings that make up the world. And this idea of being is much more extensive than what we perhaps consider just beings. Might consist of aspects of being that we would think of as material, but actually have some property of life associated with them. Thus the material world has some alive quality with it, which makes it non-material in that sense. Perhaps this is the strangest part of the view that we have here, stranger than any other from the Western viewpoint. So we very solidly believe in the material nature of the world. Here that is being undermined in a very complete kind of way. And we say that the world that you see around you, that seems to be solid and objective, its solidity is given by that mutually created reality of the beings that make up this particular world. And beings can make up different parts of the world. So it's not just a question of there's this world that we're used to, but there are many other worlds. And I don't mean the worlds in this same space. It is the mind that makes the world. It isn't like there's a great space and all the worlds appear in it. The space is a creation of the mind. The time is a creation of the mind. As many, as it were, minds and mutual sort of reciprocity of experience, that gives you how many different worlds there might be. In fact, there are, in this way, endless worlds. There's no limit to the number of worlds that are possible. You can't ask yourself, you can't say, where are these worlds? You know, a physicist can't come along and say to you, well, you say there are these worlds, where are they? You wouldn't be able to point them out because they're not worlds in this physical space particularly. This universe is one particular kind of world, but that's all it is. It's just one particular kind. There are endless kinds. Because the apparent world is created from mind and the experience of mind, the things that appear in it don't follow necessarily the ordinary rules of physics and behavior. So this means that you can have apparently objects in the world that come from, say, your karma or your action of aggression, and yet seemingly seem to be physical and objective, although actually they are there and they are the productions of mind, and they may be common to a large number of people because you may live in a world, not just a world in which people have different emotions or different tendencies, but a world in which there's a particular type of aggression or a particular type of desire or a particular type of delusion. And that commonness of that world binds the beings in it together. I want you to have the opportunity at this point of asking some questions. It would probably be good if some of them were on that part of the talk that dealt with why the world appears as it is from this particular Buddhist viewpoint.
I've been thinking about memory a lot. I've heard you speak before about time, and I don't know if it's actually to do with what you just asked us to, but I'm still wondering if you could just say, what could memory be then?
Memory seems to be a particular kind of experience. Well, perhaps I should say this first. What we say is we are trying to undermine the notion of past, present and future. And it's important to do that. The reason it's important to do that is because people cling and grasp at the ideas of past, present and future very strongly. So therefore, the necessity to undermine that, and the Buddhist thing, of course, is always to undermine grasping in some way. And it might seem, and people often do ask this question, well, are you saying there's no past, present or future? Well, not particularly. All I'm saying is you can undermine them so that the grasping collapses. But there isn't anything particularly wrong with talking about past, present, and future. And they're just, in a sense, ideas or notions that point to something, might point to a particular experience. The problem is grasping at these things as if they had some reality that they don't have. So something like that we call memory, it isn't a particular problem to call something memory and to say it's a memory of the past somehow. That doesn't matter very much. It's realizing that the past is simply a particular set of experiences within the consensus reality which relate to other people's experience in a particular way, that it's useful sometimes to use the word past to talk about all of that, present sometimes to talk about another way of thinking, and the future. So in that way, memory is a particular kind of dynamic that relates to those experiences. The problem is when you start thinking, as I say, that it is all very solid and very real and much realer than it actually is. The reason I say that is because if you're, what they call the power of your mind, the power of your samadhi is very strong, some of the things to do with past, present and future could actually be changed. And because one has great difficulty believing that, You know, if they said I could change the past, you'd probably think, well, he's crazy. But it is actually possible to do things like that. Certainly we don't have any problem about, as it were, shaping the future. We don't think of changing the future because it hasn't happened yet. But we do think we could shape it in some way. And similarly, we think we can influence the present because we feel that we're in it. But the past seems like a monolith, untouchable. And that's a very sad thing you see with old people sometimes. The idea that their lives are a great regret of the things they never did or the things they did do that they shouldn't have done. But actually, you have power over those moments of memory, those moments of the sense of the past and what you wanted to do that you didn't do and what you should have done, whatever it is that you're concerned about. You have some power over that, and actually you can change the way you think about that, your attitude to it, and even though that's going further afield, change the thing itself, because what is the thing itself? If you think the thing itself exists totally independently of anything, you believe it has substantial existence. But the past has no more substantial existence than the present. Tibetans have a nice thing they say past, present and future don't exist. That's quite a nice downright statement. Why? The past doesn't exist because it's gone. Present doesn't exist because as soon as it appears, it has gone. As soon as you say that's the present, you're talking about something else. And the future hasn't arrived. So none of it's true. None of it exists in that sense.
But if past is an illusion, how do you explain incarnation?
Incarnation. The idea of rebirth. And so on, I've already said that for the thing to be illusion isn't a problem. Things can relate to each other in an illusory way. In fact, the best way, surprisingly enough, the best way for things to appear in a solid way is for them to be illusory. Maybe that sounds paradoxical, but let me rephrase that perhaps. People sometimes say, when we talk about everything being empty or void or total illusion, maybe, we feel that's very difficult because we feel, well, that means things don't really exist somehow. They're not really graspable in some sense, so it's kind of a problem. But the interesting thing is that if things were truly real, nothing would seem to exist at all. Because if everything was truly real, none of it would change, because that's what truly real means. It means it doesn't change. If it changes, it's not the same thing anymore. So if it remains totally unchanged, it also becomes imperceptible, because you cannot enter to perceive something. You have to enter into some relationship with it. You can't do that with something that never changes. So if the world immediately became completely real and solid, it would blink out of existence like that. So everything has to be empty in order for it to seem to exist. I don't know whether that sounds paradoxical or not, but the fact is the illusory nature of things is indispensable for their apparent existence. And that means, if you talk about rebirth and new incarnation, let's assume for the moment we're not going to argue about in what sense that may or may not be true. Let's suppose that it is. Then it could only appear because everything is illusion, not because everything isn't illusion. If everything was, as I be repeating myself, if I said, if everything was truly real, nothing would exist. It's only the fact that everything is illusory that things can appear to exist, from rebirth, future lives, or whatever you might want to call them, giving credence for that to some extent, including the world as you perceive it now. working with the sense of memory, the lady who asked me the question before, is exactly the same thing, exactly the same situation. It's a kind of dynamic that you're working with. It is illusory. Through illusion, it is possible to have something like memory. If that weren't true, then memories wouldn't exist either. So there is that absolute necessity of the dynamic of experience, you might say, in order to create the apparent world of past, present, and future. And yet it is, as I want to say, even more illusory than you might imagine, because it turns out that even the rock-solid apparent things that happened in the past and can't be changed happen to be actually changeable events under the impact, perhaps, of some powerful input, like some kind of samadhi, maybe. But they are changeable. They are malleable. They can be something other than what they seem to be. Anything else?
Rigdzin, Shikpo, could I ask about the mirror? Whether there's any, at the core of someone, whether there's any sort of individual flavour. The nearest I feel I've ever experienced in an individual, the falling away of ego, has been one or two people very close to death, where somehow there was an individual flavour, and I wondered how that related to the mirror itself.
And maybe you have to change the image a little bit. There's more than one image of using the mirror, as it were. One is that there is a central spot of light, power, knowledge, as it were, which has the power to radiate forth some kind of clarity or some kind of illumination. And that, as it were, appears in this world as it falls on the mirror. Then you have the appearances of the different beings. And in some sense, the light from the mirror is reflected back to the place of its origin. So there's a kind of communication that takes place. There still isn't any object in the mirror, but there's like a toing and froing effect somehow. From this point of view, different beings have different appearances in the mirror as far as their the appearances maybe of their physical body, how they appear to you, and so on in a gross sort of way. And we'd just say that for the moment are the different appearances that would be in the mirror. You're relating, say, to different people, then you get a sense of two things, really. And it's to do with what you might call the reconvergence of the light, you might say, back to the original source. The original source couldn't really be differentiated as different for the different people. However, very close to the source, as they go out, using this image, the light rays begin to diverge and take on a certain individuality, a certain individual trip, you might say. As they diverge slightly, then they get individual characteristics because they're doing that. So it's like it would be true to say there is individuality in the way you describe, but at the same time, in the core of that perhaps is more difficult to see, there's also some unity that joins them together with all other beings in the universe, you might say. Just like to use another image, if you looked at the islands on a sea, they all seem to be separate from each other. If you follow the mountains down to the bedrock, then the bedrock is the same. What you've got is really extensions of the bedrock in the form of mountains. And they seem to, because of the water, they seem to be, and you can't see through the water, they seem to be individual entities, but they're all connected fundamentally. So the same thing here, all beings really are fundamentally connected in some absolute sense, come from the same source, the same, using the characteristics we're talking about, the same basic nature of mind or wisdom mind. That's the same. But as you begin to emerge from that, some slight changes and differences begin to appear. And that's what gives everything in the world, in fact, not just your friends that you were speaking of, the different individual sense of being different individuals, sense of there being different parts of the world, different dimensions, different constituents, different conditionality, and so forth. Okay. But it's certainly true. It's very noticeable sometimes near dying people. There is that begin to get the sense of something which is not just their personality that you were used to before, something special. That's very important, actually, if you do reach the point of having a teacher. That's an important aspect of the dying process of working with the teacher, is to be with the teacher, if you can, at that point. Because then, as it were, what he is in his own nature begins to manifest independently of the particular conditions and things connected with how he appears in the world. Something, as it were, more intrinsic than that begins to appear. And that becomes tremendously significant for the teacher's pupils. So what you're describing, yeah, definitely is a very real thing and does occur in the Dharma quite a lot. That Tibetans call that, working with that particular experience, what they call the lamas or the gurus tukdam, meaning is special mind or heart connection to pupils. So thank you for mentioning that. It's good to bring that up. Anything else?
I was thinking about what you said about everything we do having our signature on it. Mm-hmm. And I had the sense of kind of being bound by our egocentricity. Yeah. But then you also talk about the consensus reality, and it almost seems like there's a contradiction. On the one hand, we're bound by our own experiences, but simultaneously, we're experiencing reality jointly with others. Mm.
Well, not everything is ego, fortunately. Otherwise, we'd have had it. There's no way it would be possible to reach any kind of realization or liberation of any kind, whether you had a teacher or not. You know, you'd be die-stamped with ego all the way through, just like a stick of rock that says Brighton all the way through. So it's not 100% ego. But as far as kind of, and certainly, you know, there is this consensus reality that exists that enables me mutually to, I mean, I don't consciously know that I'm working with others, but that's what's happening. My consciousness at some quite deep level is gelling somehow with that of others, and that is what is giving the appearance of this apparently independently existing world. That's quite a clever trick when you think about it, really. So that's okay. But as soon as you have things that is going on, and it's very important that you don't know that you're doing this process, because otherwise it would be stamped by ego, and you would begin to get a real solipsistic world in which you think you made the world as well. So it's quite important not to realize in some way that, excuse me, to realize in some way, or not to realize that you are involved in the creation of this. You're involved in the creation of it, you might say, unconsciously, if you want to say it, I think more than subliminally, certainly unconsciously, you're involved with the creation of this world. But as soon as it becomes a much more conscious thing, and grasping is involved in a very conscious way, then one can't evolve this ego stamp that one has on things. It's there. And one is not so mad in this non-solipsistic universe to think that I made everybody around me. I don't look at you all and say, oh, aren't I wonderful? I've invented all these people. You know, anybody who really thinks like that would be or more than off their heads. In fact, some Tibetans have said, well, you must avoid thinking like that. Another one of my teachers said, that's ridiculous, nobody thinks like that. You don't have to guard against thinking in some, you know, that's madder than mad to think like that. He said, nobody thinks like that. So, all right, let's take that as true for the moment. Nobody thinks like that. So I do believe that the so-called things that we generally call existing in the external world have the sense of other for me. You know, when I speak to you, I believe I'm talking to a live thinking person from their own side. I don't think it's my... I mean, I could if I was being very sort of strict perceptual thing, saying, oh, it's only this perception of this person opening their mouth and closing it again, sounds come out, all I'm hearing is the sound, all I'm seeing is their lips. It's really all still just my invention. As I say, nobody thinks like that. I can't go into, at the moment, I think it takes us too far afield to go into a particular way how you explain how the fact that things are like that links into the reality of way things appear in the other sense. But there is a way when one can develop that. But the point is we do have a sense of other. And the guru, the person who's teaching us, is definitely other because he's a different person. That's why gurus must be somebody, as said, somebody you can shake hands with. You can't have, I'd say, I've got a great guru in my mind. That's no good. A great guru in your mind never disagrees with you fundamentally. You have to have somebody who says, no, you're wrong. You need that kind of a guru. So it's necessary to remember that. And that person will be able to chip off your name from the grasping bit of your mind. It's important. Okay. Anything else?
Can I ask one question? What would you say to this purely scientific view of where our thoughts in the brain, like electrical signals and chemical?
Well, again, that's an appearance of things in the physical world, and what we would say is that the apparent physicality of the brain and all that is itself a creation from mind in the way I described earlier, that it can produce apparent physical things. Now, you might say, what is, from Buddhist point of view, the reason why we might have brains? You know, you might think, well, what do you need a brain for? From Buddhist perspective, you know, somehow it ought to all be able to work itself without that. The answer seems to be the actual opposite from what it seems to be. So we think, well, we have a brain and we have a sensory setup in order to perceive the external world. Well, things in Buddhism are often the opposite way round from the ordinary view. So just like when we say, well, there's a material world and we all perceive it, and we say, no, that's wrong, it's because all our perceptions and understanding get together that the idea of the material world arises. In other words, it's the exact opposite. So it is with the body, the physical setup of the brain and so on that perceives, because we say, well, you're perceiving the external world. We say, no, what's happening is actually it cuts down. The purpose of the brain, the sensory apparatus, is to cut down what you perceive. not to expand it. It's as though you're already open to, you might say, the endlessness of the universe by nature. But if you're going to appear to help people, as it were, as a bodhisattva, as we say, in a particular neck of the woods in the universe, you have to be a person of this world. It's no good saying, somebody coming to you and saying, please help me about this particular thing, and they say to you, my mind is vast, it spreads everywhere. I really have no idea what your problem's about. My mind is too vast to perceive your problem. You have to be able to narrow down to experience what the person's problem is, and eventually to perhaps help them in the process of becoming liberated if you're a bodhisattva. So you would say, well, it enables me to, this setup of senses, brain and so on, enables me to appear in this world and enables me to help others because it narrows everything down so that is possible. It's thought that there are dangers in doing that, and the dangers in doing that is you get lost in ordinary experiences, and you start, if you started off as a bodhisattva, a kind of wonderful person who want to help others, you might actually lose yourself in the world and just get involved with ordinary desires and thoughts and so on and drift off. So that's the danger. And it's thought, well, sometimes great bodhisattvas do that and take the risk just in order to help others. And if they make a mistake and something goes wrong, well, I suppose you could say they're part of the problem instead of part of the solution. But some beings, of course, have got completely stuck in that, and just, although they may come trailing clouds of glory from the nature of reality originally, they're now kind of stuck in this world in a confused way and suffer the results of karma and its results, and be the fruit of karma. So I don't know whether that helps you, but it's the best I can do, I think, on that. Anything else anybody wants to ask? I think if there aren't, then we can close there and we'll continue with karma and its results and the wrong ideas about it in the afternoon session. So thank you very much. Thank you.